This is the second part of Lecture 29 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds on the creation of the Crusader States in the early Crusades. And the last time, we looked at the political situation in Western Europe and the Islamic world, as well as the Byzantine Empire. At the eve of the Crusades, we saw that while the Western Europeans were politically divided and in fact had no one single leader to sort of set them going, even the popes, who were to some degree increasing their authority by calling for this crusade, didn't actually go lead it themselves. While that was the situation in Western Europe, there was also political disunity in the Islamic world, which was fundamental to the success of this First Crusade. And it's part of the reason why the First Crusade is the only truly successful crusade. We saw that Urban had called for this organized march east, and the variety of ways that he tried to convince people to do this, including the offering of indulgences, which I explained in some detail. But of course, I also mentioned that in the end, he only lit the fire. He could not control it. We can see the popular appeal of the crusade in the frenzy that came next. And horrifyingly, this really began with violence at home. Western Christians, now convinced that they needed to kill non-Christians in order to receive their remission of sins, realized that they had some to hand, much closer than the distant Muslim threat. Before setting on crusade, these mobs of crusaders massacred thousands of Jews living in tiny communities in Western Europe. This group is often referred to as the People's Crusade. They are not initially ordered by Urban. Instead, they're largely drawn up by popular preachers who imitate Urban's preaching all over Western Europe. Urban had actually called for the Crusaders to take an entire year to plan their expedition. This was going to be a major expedition, but some people were so taken up by his call that they immediately set out, and it appears to be these mobs of people who were too fervent to even wait to go on crusade and plan this crusade, who began massacring Jews. And there's no excuse for these atrocities, and there cannot be an excuse for these atrocities. This is really the first organized violence against Jews in the Middle Ages. That's not to say that Christians in Western Europe, in the East, had not persecuted Jews before, but this is the first large-scale violence where entire communities of Jews are wiped out. And it was directly caused by crusading fever. The Crusades, in other words, take an existing anti-Judaism, what will become anti-Semitism, and take it to a new level. This is an important moment in Jewish as well as in Christian history, and particularly in Jewish-Christian relations. This, of course, revolved around older ideas about hating Jews that had been preached by Christians for hundreds of years, that Jews were the ones who had killed Jesus, a sense of animosity at Jews for not having converted to Christianity, and so on and so forth. But it takes it to a new level of violence that had not existed before the Crusades. Now, it's worth pointing out here that many bishops and secular officials actually attempted to save Jewish communities during this violence. Not all Christians joined in on this orgy of violence. This was not what Urban had called for in his speech. All of our accounts agree with that. But the motivation for protecting Jews here was economic. Not purely spiritual. Jews were an outcast community. They had very little political voice for reasons that we'll talk about in a later lecture. They tended to have a supply of cash on hand because they weren't allowed to perform agricultural work in many communities, so they had to perform money lending and mercantile work. And local officials could largely tax Jews as much as they wanted, and no one would complain except the Jews who no one cared about. So Jews were sort of a cash cow, and local Christian bishops often tried to protect them from mobs of violent crusaders, largely because this was going to see a real downturn in their own economic prospects. So this element of crusading is very important to understand, that this violence directed against non-Christians affects non-Christians in Western Europe as well as Muslims in the Holy Land in the Middle East. Now, the Crusaders who eventually set out were not the kings of Europe. No king of Europe went on the First Crusade, at least no significant king of Europe. These kings were either too weak or too busy stabilizing their kingdoms to afford to spend years away from home. And the Crusades always took years. This is a time, remember, before airplanes, before modern boats and ships. You were going to have to go there on foot or on horseback. The First Crusade actually uses virtually no naval capabilities to get anywhere. And then, of course, once you got there, where you were going to be spending months at the very least campaigning in the Holy Land. So everybody was going to take years. Most kings of Europe couldn't afford to do this for the First Crusade for reasons that we've talked about earlier. Instead, contingents of nobles from across Western Europe set out, but without a single designated leader. And you can get a sense of this by this map that I have up here. Here's a map of the various parts of the First Crusade. Notice how there are all these arrows for the different routes taken by different crusading groups, each one led by a different major noble, like Hugh of Vermandois, the brother of the King of France, Godfrey de Bouillon, who was a major noble on the border between France and the Holy Roman Empire, Bohemond, who was a relative of the King of Sicily, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who was a nobleman from southern France, Robert Curthose, who had inherited the Duchy of Normandy, a variety of other figures. You don't need to know all of these names, but I just want to give you a sense of how complex this First Crusade was. Now, many of these nobles were Normans. Some of them were from the Duchy, like Robert Curthose, and newly conquered England, but more of them came from much closer in the Kingdom of Sicily, who were already used to the Mediterranean climate, and were obviously the closest part of Western Europe to the Crusades, to Jerusalem. The Normans tended not to get along with other factions, but there was a great deal of disunity in general. Western European culture, while it shared certain commonalities that I mentioned, particularly going back to our lecture on the Carolingian Renaissance, was broken up into many different cultural zones and languages, even within the various kingdoms that we've looked at. So, for instance, there were many different regions of France that were speaking different versions of French that were practically different languages that were not mutually intelligible. Modern French is an evolution of what was Northern French language. Southern French language was effectively a separate language and very much a different culture from the Northern French. So despite notions of nobility and knighthood shared by many of the Crusader leadership, they did not trust each other. And they felt that they came to some degree from different cultures. Well, it was over 1,000 miles just to reach Constantinople for most of the Crusaders. And when they did get there, Alexios was shocked by the response to his letter. He was particularly shocked by the elements of the People's Crusade that did eventually make it there. He tried to warn them. This initial group from the People's Crusade is massacred and wiped out by the Muslims. This, of course, causes enormous problems, as the remnants of the People's Crusade tells the Western Crusaders not to trust Alexios because he didn't back them up. Alexios couldn't back them up because they were doing something stupid by going out without enough resources. And of course, this actually turned out to be a good move in some parts because the Turks got the idea that these Crusaders were going to be a real pushover because all they encountered was largely peasants on the People's Crusade. So there was already disasters even before most of these noble contingents that I just talked about showed up in Constantinople in 1096. Now, Alexios was very clever. He was very educated on what was going on in Western Europe. The diplomatic and intelligence corps of the Byzantine Empire was far in advance of practically anyone else's at the time. And Alexios understood what we have loosely described as feudalism in our previous lecture. And so Alexios, even though the Byzantine Empire didn't run on anything even like the feudal system that we talked about last time, Alexios demanded that the Crusaders swear oaths to him as their liege lord, making any territory they recovered into fiefs and them his vassals. Like I said, that's not the way things worked in the Byzantine Empire, but Alexios understood how Western feudal politics worked, at least in the broad strokes that I discussed last time. So Alexios then agreed to provide immense logistical support. That is, he was going to provide supplies, intelligence. Remember, most of these Crusaders had never been in this region before. Some people had managed to get to the Holy Land, but this was it doesn't seem that very many of them were actually going on this crusade. Alexios needed to provide this kind of support. He even sent Byzantine armies out into the field to help sweep the roads clear for the Crusaders, although not to actually fight alongside them. Byzantine and Crusader forces did not fight side by side. There were problems with command. I think Alexios rightly didn't really want to turn over any of his forces to an overall Crusader commander, even if there had been one, and of course the Crusaders didn't want to take orders from him either. Alexios also sent the Byzantine navy to help supply the Crusaders once they eventually reached the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. Well, what's going to become Turkey was at this point still Anatolia. But Alexios wasn't just negotiating with the Crusaders, he was negotiating with the Turks as well, Muslim forces. And he was using the threat of the Crusaders as a bargaining chip to get Turkish commanders to surrender territory to him. And the Byzantines had been used to negotiating with Muslims for centuries, and they thought nothing of this. As we have seen, the earlier Byzantine Emperor Basil II had made an alliance with the Fatimid Shiite caliphs against the Abbasid Sunni caliphs. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Byzantines have been next to Muslims for hundreds of years at this point, and there is a sort of, they don't necessarily get along with each other. They're to some degree hostile to each other, but they have learned to have diplomatic relations with one another. Alexios in particular did this with the first major attack that the Crusaders make, the noble Crusaders, not those peasants who got wiped out, in an attack on actually Nicaea, that place where that famous council that we looked at earlier took place. Nicaea was under Turkish command. The Crusaders had surrounded it. Alexios negotiated with the commander the Muslim commander in Nicaea and negotiated his surrender. And the commander then turned the city over to Alexios, not the Crusaders. Well, the Crusaders were very unhappy with this. First of all, they were really looking forward to looting Nicaea and getting some money, which would have, been, and at the very least, supplies. And they really also just did not understand this idea of Alexios negotiating with Muslims. They had come all this way to kill Muslims, to protect the Greeks and Alexios. Western Christians often saw this as traitorous, as downright unchristian, because they were not used to dealing with Muslims. They were not used to this diplomatic process. And this really emphasizes the problems that we looked at 2 lectures ago with the Great Schism between Eastern Greek Christianity and Western Latin Christianity. There were already cultural problems between these two groups of Christians, and the Crusades exacerbate, they increase the tensions that are going on, that have been going on behind the scenes for hundreds of years at this point. And that's a factor that we're going to see play out with tragic consequences in later Crusades. But it's an important factor to understand even as early on as this First Crusade. Because the first major victory of the First Crusade made in the Levant, or the Holy Land as they called it, in the northern Levant, in what we would call Syria, after a grueling march with many battles across Asia Minor, showed how broken this relationship between the Eastern and Western Christians was. And that was the siege of the city of Antioch. Remember that Antioch was the old Seleucid capital way back in the Hellenistic era. It was a major city. It was a patriarchate. That is, it was one of the most important cities in early Christianity. There was the bishop there was a patriarch, the highest level of bishop one can have in the Christian church. It was the city in which Christians were first referred to as Christians. And so it was a major goal. It was also the first really major city in the Levant, in what was then called Syria. Actually, Antakya, which is the modern remains of Antioch, is now a part of Turkey, but it's really outside of the peninsula of Asia Minor. That's an accident of modern politics. So taking Antioch was absolutely essential. It was the first territory that was really outside of the Byzantine norm. And the Crusaders absolutely had to have it in order to keep going on. It was an absolutely grueling siege. It lasted many months, and as soon as the Crusaders took the city of Antioch, a Muslim relief army showed up and put the Crusaders under siege themselves. Some of the Crusaders, in the course of all of these disasters, and there were really multiple times where the Crusaders should have been wiped out, but various groups of Muslims refused to cooperate with each other. Remember, like I said, there are multiple different competing Muslim political leaders in this time period. And Antioch is the first time that we can really see this. Multiple relief armies show up, but they don't work together to defeat the Crusaders. And they don't necessarily get along with the Muslims inside Antioch either. So the Crusaders managed to hold on, but it was a very near thing, and some Crusaders fled the siege of Antioch. And when they did, they ran into a Byzantine army sent by Alexios to help the Crusaders. Alexios had been sort of clearing things up in Asia Minor. The Crusaders had caused enormous disruptions. They had defeated several Turkish armies in a number of battles in Asia Minor, but they had kept moving on. They had not left people behind as yet. And so Alexios had been sort of securing these victories that the Crusaders had made for himself. Remember, his goal was to retake Asia Minor from this. Alexios, however, now is about to come help out the Crusaders at Antioch, which he really wants for his empire as well. It would be an enormous prize for himself, and he encounters these fleeing Crusaders. And these fleeing Crusaders, of course, don't want to make themselves look bad like they're cowards, and so these fleeing Crusaders say that the situation in Antioch is hopeless. Now, Alexios has a difficult choice here. He doesn't have unlimited resources, of course. That's part of the reason why he called these Crusaders in the first place, and so Alexios has to decide, do I try and help what he's being told by Crusaders themselves is a lost cause in Antioch, or does he go back and make sure that he secures all the gains that the Crusades have made in Asia Minor? And Alexios chose what, in the moment, probably looked like the safe choice, which was he did not go onwards to Antioch. But unfortunately for Alexios and the Byzantines, the Crusaders did succeed in Antioch. And in fact, the guy who tried to portray himself as the victor at Antioch, Bohemond, who was the leader of the Sicilian Norman faction, immediately upon finding out that Alexios had turned around, declared that the oaths that he had made to Alexios, remember Alexios had made these Western Europeans swear vows of vassalage to him as their liege lord. Bohemond, the leader of these Normans, declares that his oaths are null and void because his liege lord Alexios has not behaved towards him as he should. He has not helped out his vassals. And so the Normans declared Antioch to be an independent city-state, a Crusader state. The Byzantines never accepted this, and they repeatedly tried to take Antioch from the Normans and force them to accept the overlordship of the Byzantine emperors. So here we can see some of this back and forth negotiation and difficulty within the feudal relationships that I talked about last time being played out with the situation in Antioch. But now the Christians have taken a very important city. Of course, now the Norman Bohemond says, well, you know, I got to hold on to Antioch. You guys keep going on to Jerusalem. And if there is any Crusader in the First Crusade who does fit the mold of that old argument that the Crusaders are really only here to win territory and they don't really have religious motivations, then probably Bohemond is the guy who best fits this. He's really out to become an independent ruler, and he basically tells everyone else, yeah, go ahead, you take Jerusalem, I don't care. Well, only about, remember, probably as many as 100,000 people set out on the First Crusade. Only about 15,000 of them eventually reached Jerusalem in 1099 in July. Ironically, the city at this point was under the control of the Fatimids. It had been taken since Alexios had sent those letters, and actually even since Urban had called the First Crusade in 1095. And the Fatimids were allies of the Byzantines and enemies of the Turks. But it didn't matter. The Crusaders by this point were exhausted. They had been on crusade for years, and they were going to take the city. Eyewitness Crusader accounts describe the sack of Jerusalem as absolutely brutal. The Christians murdered everyone they found inside the walls, piling up bodies in the streets. At the Dome of the Rock, which in their ignorance Crusaders thought was Solomon's temple, destroyed 1,500 years earlier by the Babylonians, Crusaders waded in blood that came up to their knees. This is from Crusaders' reports themselves. The Crusaders called this the judgment of God, and they rejoiced that Christ had given them victory over unbelievers in his own city. Now, for the Muslims, of course, this was a catastrophe. This was the psychological impact of the loss of Jerusalem is in some ways comparable to the Gothic sack of Rome in 410. Although, of course, as I've mentioned before, the Gothic sack of Rome was quite civilized and restrained, whereas the sack of Jerusalem in 1099 is one of the worst massacres and most ruthless sacks we know of in history, an absolute, almost genocide to some degree, far more bloody. But the Muslims were still badly divided. Indeed, that is certainly what had allowed the Crusaders to win this victory in the first place. Fatimid Shiites fighting Abbasid and Turkish Sunnis, various Seljuk chieftains fighting each other, no one getting along. This is the only reason that the First Crusade was successful in the long run. They had not faced united resistance, and it would be another 2 generations before the Muslims organized. But when they did, as we shall see, the Crusades were really in trouble. Meanwhile, the Crusaders dug into a handful of independent states that they carved out along the coast of the Mediterranean. We today call these the Crusader Principalities, and there were several of them, but the 2 most important we have already encountered. One was the Principality of Antioch, a Norman principality, and sometimes you hear these all referred to as the Crusader Principalities. It's a little confusing because we use various words like county and principality and kingdom, and they all had some notional dependence upon the most important of these, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as it was called. All of these principalities were ad hoc creations made in the moment. No one seems to have planned in advance how these new states would work, and in fact they only really existed because of the breakdown of Byzantine-Crusader relations. Remember, all of this theoretically was supposed to be under the overlordship of Alexios. That's at least what Alexios' plan was from the beginning. Most Crusaders, however, returned home immediately. They had done what they claimed to do. They came to do, and they had received their remission of sins. They went home. They were not interested in staying. This again calls into question the entire argument that the Crusades are about conquest. For many of these Crusaders, it clearly was not about conquest. And actually, in further Crusades, we'll see kings come out on crusade, like Richard the Lionheart. They do not seem to be particularly interested in conquest. They don't hold any territory that they help to conquer in the Holy Land. This was seen as a pan-Western Christian endeavor by many Crusaders. The new king of Jerusalem in 1099 wrote desperate letters to Western leaders, much as Alexios had done a decade previously, telling them that he only had 300 knights to defend the entirety of his kingdom. At the end of the First Crusade, really, the kingdom of Jerusalem that you see here in this map with a large amount of territory was really nothing but Jerusalem itself. Much more needed to be done. The local Christian population does not appear to be where these Crusaders were going to draw from. I'll get to that in a moment. But the Crusaders, remember, had also alienated the Byzantines. So they weren't going to be getting much support from them unless they were willing to submit, which the Crusaders were not willing to do. So the Crusader states were dependent on Western European immigration. They were, in effect, Western European colonies in the Holy Land that were going to be dependent on more colonists coming from Western Europe. Why did they not use the local Christian population? You may remember from our lecture on the beginnings of the Islamic Caliphate in the First Muslim Empire that the Christian population was probably still a majority in this region of the world, in the Levant, all the way up to the Crusades. So why not just adopt these local Christians? Well, that was because these local Christians had been under Muslim rule for generations, and part of the Dhimmi Pact, that Pact of Umar as it's often called, was that these Christians would be disarmed. Now, that wasn't true of every group of Christians. There were, for instance, some Armenians in the northern parts of the Levant who had a warrior culture. But the Crusaders were largely quite dismissive of these local Christians to begin with, many of whom they considered to be heretics. And a sort of victim blaming was also on their minds as well, where the Crusaders distrusted local Christians for having lived under Muslim rule and not having resisted adequately enough. Crusaders further alienated many of these local Christians by imposing their own Latin Christianity on them. So the local Christians were not going to be a major source of the necessary recruits to preserve these Crusader states, these colonies. The Crusader states formed a new identity, however, in the Holy Land, which they increasingly referred to as Outremer, over the sea, a collective term for the various petty states put together. By 1140, a generation or two later, perhaps 50,000 Western Europeans and their descendants were ruling over 3 million native Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews. The Westerners formed a ruling elite that was a blend of the various Western cultures that the Crusaders had come from initially, and became distinctly unique because of this blending. They called themselves the Franks, as most of them had come from Charlemagne's former Frankish Empire. And in fact, one local Muslim Arabic word for Western Europeans actually is Frange, from this word Frank, the Frangi. Now, by the standards of Western Europe, the Franks of Outremer eventually ended up becoming remarkably tolerant. They had to. They actually had to make the same kind of diplomatic accommodations that we saw Western Christians had initially distrusted the Byzantines for during the First Crusade. They had made some efforts at first to force Muslims to convert, but this just wasn't practical. It couldn't be done on a large scale. However, the constant stream of new crusaders to Outremer meant that there were always going to be some fresh off-the-boat religious fanatics who didn't get how impractical it was to convert or kill every single Muslim, and would of course start violence in the name of Christ. And this was a constant problem within the Crusader States, between the local Crusaders who had grown up there and the new Crusaders from Western Europe. Now, the kings of Jerusalem and the other princes of Outremer developed remarkably effective economic tricks that blended the relatively primitive institutions that they knew back home with the much more advanced commercial system of the Middle East under the Muslims. Now, for one thing, the personal relationship of liege lords and vassals continued. That is what we have described as the sort of narrow definition of feudalism. That was something that Western Europeans in the Levant were going to continue. But in practice, the economic component that went in this, manorialism with its serfs and the lord of the manor, never caught on in Outremer. And the nobles of Outremer were absentee landlords over the iktas, those Muslim tax farms that they already found in place. Serfdom was never instituted. In practice, Outremer was a place where Westerners could go to break into, if not the nobility, then at least into the limited middle class of this era, much more easily than back home in Europe. And there was no way to force existing locals, these local Eastern Christians or Muslims or Jews, into the nasty servile arrangements of manorialism when they could easily flee to Muslim-controlled territory where they would be free. So the economic situation we saw in Western Europe could not be applied in the Holy Land, and largely the Crusaders recognized this. Meanwhile, the Crusader lords offered lucrative commercial arrangements and contracts with Italian merchants, and they relied as much on trade as they did on agriculture, which was very different from the norm we saw back in Western Europe. This had the side benefit of dramatically increasing European trade with the rest of the world for the first time in centuries, as I mentioned briefly in our last lecture. That's not to say there had been no trade, but the Crusader states dramatically increased the amount of trade going on between Western Europe and the rest of the world, because now there are these colonies in place at the heart of the world economy in the Middle East. These massive trade routes are now reconnecting with Western Europe. And it was really the Italians, who we'll see in various future lectures, were of course geographically best positioned to take advantage of this. They already had more mercantile connections. Remember that Italy was always more urban than the rest of Western Europe, even during the collapse and the aftermath of the events that had led to the collapse of the Western Roman political order. And so these relationships with the Italians were absolutely essential to the success of the Crusader states. Without this trade, the Crusader states could never have prospered economically. It was necessary to make Outremer profitable as well as holy, because holy alone wasn't going to pay the bills. All right, so that's the end of the second part of this lecture on the early Crusader states. In this one, we've covered the actual events of the First Crusade, their difficulties with the Byzantines, as well as the creation of these Crusader states of Outremer, the unique community of crusading Christians that develops in the West, these Franks of Outremer, and the economic underpinnings of those states with their connections with the Italian merchants. In the final part of this lecture, we're going to cover what happened to Outremer over the course of the rest of the 11th century, with the Second Crusade and the Third Crusade that was famously the duel between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin.